Hello everyone, welcome to version 1.1 of my Uncharted 1 Brutal Difficulty walkthrough. This will cover chapters 17 through 19, which is pretty much the so-called supernatural part of the game. So, chapters 17 through 19 are going to introduce a new enemy type, which are the Descendants. And the Descendants are the enemies that we're fighting right now. So, these are the Spaniards that were contaminated by the corpse that was inside of the El Dorado case. That corpse had a virus on it that aerosolized, and it infected these individuals. And apparently, Naughty Dog confirmed that the Descendants were breeding. I don't know how that's possible. I don't recall there ever being any female Spaniards. Like, how the hell is that even possible? That just seems a little odd. So apparently there were female Spaniards that were infected as well, or I don't really understand that. But anyway, the Descendants are incredibly gimped on Brutal Difficulty. They take roughly 3 hits to kill you, and a lot of the times when they do hit you, they run away. So this is an enemy that is more so like a gimmick enemy than an actual threat. It's just like a popcorn enemy pretty much. But despite this, I do like this enemy. In fact, I would honestly say that this is my favorite enemy type in the game, because I feel like it complements the gameplay of Uncharted 1 better than the actual enemies that fire guns at you. Like, the shooting on this game isn't very good, the cover is atrocious, the animations aren't really built for third-person shooting when you're dealing with enemies that have guns. But I think these enemies could easily complement Uncharted 1's very minimal gameplay format. And, you know, like, the gameplay actually works well. Like, you've seen me deal with these Descendants right here. It's a lot of fun. Like, you're actually seeing Nate's speed actually serve a purpose. And, you know, like, the roll actually feels like it does something, and you can actually avoid these enemies' attacks, and the feedback is incredibly good. And the Descendants, 1 hit to the head is enough to kill them. So even though these enemies are infected by this virus, they still die instantly. They're not undead, they're just still living, but they're just infected. And right here is some use of the blind fire during a chase sequence to shoot behind you to keep the enemies off of you, which they expanded upon in Uncharted 2 and not so much in Uncharted 3. I don't recall any sequences in Uncharted 3 where you were running away and you had to use the blind fire from behind in order to actually deal with a threat. But in Uncharted 2, at the beginning of the demo for Uncharted 2, you had to run away from a truck and you had to use the blind fire to get away. So cool that they brought back that mechanic for a bit in Uncharted 2. And Uncharted 4, I mean, you did use it during that motorcycle sequence in Chapter 11, but I don't know if I would really count that, because that's more so an on-rail sequence. That sequence had a little bit more involvement when I was dealing with the Descendants who were chasing me. And now we're moving on to chapters 18 and 19 right here. So, Serb 17, apparently he doesn't like this environment, and I don't know why he thinks that, because I would honestly say that this environment is more interesting than the rest of the environments we've been going through, because the jungle environments, the fortress environments, like, they all feel like reused assets the more times you see it. And it just gets to a point where nothing really stands out. And then you come to this environment, and I really feel like this is a nice change to the color palette to freshen the experience, to actually feel like you're going through the game. There's a sense of progression. It's like in Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 4, or even like Resident Evil 7, for instance, with the change of environments. Like in Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 4, you started from like medieval settings, like village settings, and then you transitioned into laboratory settings and more like contemporary settings. And it really contributed to the progression of the game, and it really made you feel like you were contributing progress to something. Like the game was actually progressing, and I just like that about those games. I mean, that's the one thing I can actually appreciate about Resident Evil 1, even though the environments are pretty boring in that game, and a lot of the choices of environment are just there to pad out the game, and we're just wasting your time with puzzles and, like, loading screens, and it really got to the point of overbearing at that point, but whereas with Resident Evil 4, I feel like that was much better. But right here, you're just dealing with a couple of Descendants in these hallways. I'm going the wrong way. This leads to an optional area that has a treasure. But when you're backtracking through this area in Chapter 19, the lights will at least showcase the way to get out of here. But you're not afforded that luxury in Chapter 18, which is not that big of a deal because the corridor isn't that expansive, and these enemies, they have a realistic amount of life. Wow, imagine if Resident Evil Village had the same kind of designs as this game when it came to these kind of infected enemies. The only reason they blow the enemy HP to an absurd degree in Resident Evil Village and they remove so many stun animations to balance out the gameplay and to actually make the gameplay interesting is just to complement the merchant system. Like they wanted like the entire gameplay experience of Resident Evil Village to be nothing but a pay-to-win system. And that's why, in order to force you to engage with the merchant system, everything had increased life, everything had very little animations to it. Yeah, that is just something that really hindered the gameplay experience of Resident Evil Village, and it's one of the things that really brings that game down in quality, and so many points are just taken away from that game because of the way they implemented the merchant system, and they tried to make the merchant system the most standout feature ever in Resident Evil Village, but it was to the game's detriment. So much for being inspired by Resident Evil 4, which was actually serviceable as a game design with no merchant in mind, as a true survival horror experience. What a disappointing game. But that being said, I can't wait to play the Resident Evil Village DLC, because at the moment I'm in kind of a dry period where I don't feel as invigorated to play Resident Evil as much, which is why I've been posting a lot of these other games, like with the Uncharted series. But, you know, like, Resident Evil's kind of in a stale period right now, and I've kind of done as much as I could with Resident Evil Village, but I just hope the DLC will be better, and it will at least reinvigorate my palate for Resident Evil, but as I've already expressed before in that one video I made, I'm not very excited for it because it just feels like it's going to be the Little Miss DLC. It's going to last for like a couple of minutes, and the plot points will not make any sense, and it's just not going to contribute to anything. I mean, the removal of Rose's powers as well, like her abilities, I don't know why I said powers, I'm an idiot for saying that. But, like, they set up Rose as having these kind of special capabilities, and you're just going to remove all those capabilities in the DLC. Like, it made it seem like they were setting up Rose for the next game, but then they're just going to cut her out entirely by making her just a part of the DLC and not with the next game. Like, what the hell is the whole point of that build-up if you're going to just remove her like that? That's just so dumb on so many levels. I don't know what they're trying to accomplish with that, but it just really feels like they're trying to rush the Resident Evil Village DLC out just so they can be done with the Winters family's storyline. And that is just a terrible way to pay off your investment into Ethan Winters and his family. It's so insulting on so many levels and downright offensive. But yeah, enough about that. We now have this combat sequence. This is where the game is picking up in difficulty. So we have these enemies. So the MP40 is a really bad weapon. It does very little damage, and the blind fire is equally as horrendous. I mean, look at that. That guy was so close to me. There is no way I should be missing as many shots as I'm missing when I'm using the blind fire. But the MP40 is so inaccurate with blind fire, and it's the same case with the other assault rifles. And this guy is doing a great job at strafing left and right to avoid my pistol shots. Of course, a part of that is due to the inaccuracy of the weapons when you're aiming. I haven't mentioned it yet, but the guns in Uncharted 1, 2, and a bit in 3, they're very inaccurate. And you know those moments in The Evil Within, for instance, where you're aiming the pistol or the magnum and your bullet fires like 6 feet outside the reticle? This game has that kind of issue, but I would say it's more annoying in this game because it happens more frequently. Whereas in Evil Within, I'd say there weren't really that many sequences where the random variable was a huge factor to consider, and the times when it was a huge factor to consider, you could just be using some other weapon. But in this game, every single weapon, except for the shotgun, every single weapon has this huge issue where the bullets, they don't fire in the middle of the reticle properly. Like, the amount of times you have your reticle perfectly positioned over an enemy's head and you fire your gun, but then the bullet would just miss. That happens so much in this game, and Uncharted 4 didn't have this issue. I mean, at long range, it kind of gave the illusion that this was a mechanic to consider, but I think that's more so just the way the reticle is programmed in Uncharted 4 at a distance, which is typical of any standard third-person game. And I would say, like, Tomb Raider could have something similar to this. Like, I'm talking about the Tomb Raider 2013 reboot and the sequel games as well. But, you know, like, firing guns at a distance, even when your reticle is perfectly positioned over an enemy's head, there would still be some inaccuracies here and there. So I'm willing to excuse that in Uncharted 4. But in Uncharted 1 and 2, the inaccuracy of your shots is so noticeable. And that was definitely one of the reasons why that previous guy I was shooting at with the M92F, he was able to avoid a lot of my shots effortlessly. Of course, a part of that is still due to my own ability as well, because the enemies, they move around a lot, and, you know, they spam animations like crazy, and I've already mentioned this, so I'm not going to flog this dead horse. You already understand what I mean by that. But we have these moments right here where the descendants are fighting the soldiers, but it's not programmed very well. Like, this is meant to be some kind of set piece where you're essentially a third party, and you have these other two parties fighting each other, but the moment you show yourself, the enemies will just prioritize you, and they will just forget all hostilities with each other just to prioritize you. And also, the descendants, even if they were going to effortlessly attack the soldiers, they don't do anything. Like, I've seen so many times in this section right here where a descendant is right near a soldier, but there's no kind of kill animation initiated by the descendant to kill the soldier. They just stand right next to the soldier and they don't do anything, or they just run around all over the place and just wait for the soldier to kill them. It's just not a well-designed system whatsoever. But this part right here is the most annoying part of Chapter 19 because there are so many enemies in this sequence. Yet again, Uncharted 1 is displaying its complete lack of intelligence with how it handles certain enemy placements. And all this game does is just throw so many enemies at you, and it becomes very tiresome, it becomes very tedious, and it becomes too much of a waiting game, and you're having to game the system so much, you're having to push a lot of arbitrary spawns. It's just not intelligent in the slightest. And the checkpoint for the sequence is back at that staircase, so every time I die, I have to go back to that staircase and shoot the enemies through the stairs, and also deal with the soldiers and the descendants. This is where I should have been a lot more liberal with my grenades, because, of course, I'm going to start Chapter 20 with none of the resources I've accrued. I'll just be starting with the PM pistol and no grenades. So I should have been a lot more liberal with my grenades here. I don't know what I was thinking. But then again, like, using grenades from a corner like this, where the corner is positioned around my left shoulder, and you can only throw grenades with your right hand, that is definitely not the right thing to do. And also, using grenades from cover, because of the fact that Nate's hitbox is extended when he's using grenades, I could have been shot in cover, which I guess was one of the main reasons why I wasn't using grenades here. But I really should have been using grenades. But here is where you're going to be waiting around a lot, because there are a couple of soldiers in the sequence, and there are a couple of descendants. But the descendants are going to be the ones that rush you, and you can see the damage that they do. Like, look at that, that's nothing. But it's nothing in a good way, because I'd much rather have that kind of damage threshold for brutal difficulty than the damage thresholds that they give the enemies with their weapons. Because this game doesn't really understand how to do good difficulty. There's so many broken designs with this game. There's so many moments where the enemies can hit you in cover. There's just a lot of really, like, poor designs with this game, and it's just not that good of an Uncharted game. And you have to be very careful when you're pushing up as well, because some of the enemies have the M92F. I think it's only one guy or maybe two guys, and that is a problem. So you're going to have to take this nice and slowly, and it just adds more fatigue to the section. But the Dragon Sniper can help out here, but you should only save the Dragon Sniper for the soldiers. Wasting the Dragon Sniper on the Descendants is the worst thing you could possibly do. And right here, I'm trying to use the third-person cover trick to peek around this corner, but of course there could be an enemy to my left right here, like down that corridor. He could have easily shot me. And here come these guys. There's the guy with the M92F, he's dead. And then here's a guy with an M4. But, like, you always feel like you've killed enough enemies, and then you push forward and some guy kills you. Like, that's why you gotta take this nice and slowly. And it's just a very draining section. I don't like this part. I mean, it could have been a properly paced section, like a lot of survival horror sections are in these kind of games, but it's just not. And it's just a very dull section. It overstays its welcome, and it's just boring. It's really boring. But all that's left now is that one sniper, and then these descendants are going to spawn from here, but you can easily run past them. And this will be the end of these chapters. So stay tuned for the future chapters. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.